So I think Nietzsche would also argue that Raskolnikov's fate is pretty much sealed, that he has to confess and admit guilt because that's how we are wired to be. And human beings don't necessarily have the free will to escape that. I did want to say though that neither one of these theories are supposed to be or sociopaths necessarily. Raskolnikov is not a sociopath, and you could see that in the next scene. In comparison to his sister, Raskolnikov is described as being almost an exact portrait of him. This quote right here: "Not so much in face as in soul, you are both melancholy, both resourceful and hot-tempered, both haughtily and both generous." So Raskolnikov is not shown as an evil person intrinsically. However, there's a sense that Raskolnikov is trying to turn himself into an egoist, trying to force himself to believe that this act of murder was just the natural way of things being. In page 411, Nietzsche writes, "Solemnity, mastering of emotion, this really dismal thing's called reflection, finally lead to the process of reason. And this reason was based on our history of hundreds of years of bloodshed and horror. It is an attempt to make a sense of our senseless emotions." This is displayed by Dostoyevsky towards the very end of the book in the most beautifully written scene probably of all time. And this scene stems from the contrast between Sonia, a character that displays a sense of purity despite all the circumstances, versus Raskolnikov. For the rest of the book, Raskolnikov continues to try to pass off his act as being courageous. And he also says that the law is based on whoever is the most dominant. In this quote, he writes that whoever is strong in mind and spirit will have power over them, and that whoever despises most things will be the lawgiver among them, and he who dares most of all will be the most in his right. And he compares him to Napoleon, who we have known to have killed and murdered hundreds of people. In fact, Dan Carlin, a historian, says that he was basically the Hitler before Hitler. The amount of bloodshed that he committed during his reign, it's unfathomable. Yet a lot of people treat him as a great war general, as a hero, as someone to be studied for, right? And that's only based on context. So in this sense, Raskolnikov is arguing that he's actually more of a hero, or he's more of a dominator, because he has to suffer through more. He's not doing it for his nation, he's not doing it for money, he's doing it to prove that he's the most courageous in this intellectual sense. And in this part of the book is interesting because this is where he talks using the word I the most. The rest of the book is mostly the third-person narration through his head. And it's kind of also filled with the run-on sentences. It not only shows his agitated mind, but also shows how egoic he's trying to become to portray his character that he really doesn't seem to be. And meanwhile, Sonia, who he's talking to right now, is only saying a couple of words, but having the most amount of impact. By doing this contrast, Raskolnikov is going off in this massive tangents of dialogue. In contrast to Sonia, it shows him as being way more agitated, like his mind is not free from this burden that he just took on. It ends with him being in despair. That's what the word Dostoyevsky uses is. And he asks, "Well, what am I to do? Will you come and see me in prison?" And Sonia answers with a heartwarming, "Oh, I will, I will." Essentially, without even having to do much, Raskolnikov comes to the decision that he probably should confess. Sonia doesn't really have to do that much. She just stays pure and good in her own way. And Raskolnikov is forced to come in terms with that himself. Now, Raskolnikov writes that reasonably it doesn't make any sense for him to turn himself in, because at this point, even though he is a suspect, there's no evidence for him to be the criminal, and someone else has been arrested already. But there's almost no reason for him to confess. However, Dostoyevsky is arguing that crime itself is a massive burden without necessarily even thinking about the punishment part of it. And this is done by comparing and contrasting the character of Svid. I don't know how to say his Russian name. This full thing is this, but that's a hard thing to pronounce for me. I'm sorry. Svid was Donya's one-time master, and he's also an absolutely disgusting sexual exploiter. And he's driven to desperation for Donya while committing hundreds of affairs and really disgusting crimes with children. Even he's forced to go on a redemption path by Dostoyevsky. He starts giving off money to everyone, and he's just being extremely charitable with his wealth. However, this doesn't succeed. In the end, he says he's going to America, then pulls out a revolver to commit suicide. No matter how wealthy and rich Svid was, it wasn't good enough for him to be redeemed. The suicide is also passed off as being almost like a joke, and that really dehumanizes Svid and shows him as a complete failure of what Dostoyevsky, his vision for a moral being is. And similarly, I think Nietzsche would argue that despite all of his wealth and prestige, Svid could never pay off the debt that he fostered for himself, and that pain drove him mad. In contrast to Svid, Raskolnikov confesses to his crime, driven by his family and Sonia, specifically Sonia. The narration switches over to almost giving him no dialogue in this part, But this actually makes him look more stoic and almost heroic. And he's characterized as having a massive concern and care for his family. Even though he is suffering, he's still thinking about them. The narrative voice, however, shows that Raskolnikov actually doesn't have an intellectual understanding of the wrongness of his doing. In page 425, he basically says he's a failure, but not necessarily for committing a crime, but confessing and not being able to get away with it, unlike Napoleon or whatever. It seems to be a direct criticism by Dostoyevsky on the faculty of reasoning and how that just leads to a rabbit hole. The fact that Raskolnikov didn't think about this before he committed the murder shows that the reasoning of the act comes after the act has been done. The redemptive part of Raskolnikov doesn't come from him just confessing or admitting to his guilt, or even picking up the New Testament. It seems to come from extreme care and love that he feels for Sonia. He writes, he knew with what infinite love he would now repay for all her suffering, and how life had finally stepped into a place of theory and something quite different would work itself out now. Essentially, in this part, it's saying life itself is becoming the mode for morality almost, rather than using the theory and faculty of reasoning. So we had it on backwards before. It's supposed to be the other way around. I think Nietzsche would definitely agree with this part, that theory and reasoning actually gets in the way of life. Human beings are much more sentimental. We do things for our pain and pleasure, and we balance out the reasoning or make up the reasoning afterwards. In the end of the book, Dostoyevsky doesn't make it clear that Raskolnikov is religious at all. It just makes him sound like he wants to be like Sonia, who he feels a sense of purity and conviction from. He wants to be like her, and that sense of desire or a sentiment that he has for her is a reason why he wants to be good. I'm not necessarily saying I agree with both these authors. It is an interesting topic to mention, where about rationality versus sentimentality. Where does our sense of morality really come from? I think it's really hard to say, but I think I'm much more of the second half. I think we do reason things based on how we feel, and that's not an argument that neither one seem to disagree with necessarily.